I'm Dave Baker, Director of the Program in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics. I'm so glad to welcome you to the 2024 PPE lecture. This is going to be one of those introductions where it's not so clear that the speaker needs any introduction. So in the separation of powers between the people you're going to hear from today, I see my role as a limited one to just mention some things that you should know about Professor Amar that he may be too modest to say himself. Akhil Amar is a native of Ann Arbor. He's not too modest to mention that. He takes pride in it. After completing college at Yale and law school there, he clerked for Justice Stephen Breyer at the United States Supreme Court. He became a professor of law at Yale at age 26 and remains still on the faculty there as the Sterling Professor of Law. He is the 18th most cited legal scholar of all time. And in particular, he's been cited in over 40 Supreme Court cases. He's the author of several books, most recently, The Words That Made Us. And he's also a podcaster. He has a popular and fascinating podcast, America's Constitution, together with co-host Andy Lipka. If you enjoy what you hear today, I recommend the podcast highly. Welcome, Professor Amar.
Thank you so much. It's a beautiful day outside, and you've chosen instead to share your time with me, and I'm very, very grateful. So, September 19th, 2 days after September 17th, which is known as Constitution Day. You all know that July 4th is known as Independence Day because in 1776, on July 4th, America declares its independence, right? No, I tricked you. Actually, America declares its independence on July 2nd, 1776. Oh, you already learned something new, maybe. How many of you did not know that fact? Okay, good. What happens on July 4th, 1776? Oh, we Americans, and they're not my genetic forebears, but I can affiliate with this project. I'll say a little bit more about that in just a minute. We adopt a Declaration of Independence, setting forth our reasons for doing this, trying to submit facts to a candid world about why we are justified in doing what we are doing, what we have done on July 2nd, which is to declare that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. That's July 2nd, and on July 4th we give a statement of reasons. And you all know, of course, it was authored by Thomas Jefferson. Oh, but not quite, truthfully. He was one on a committee, and then the committee modified it, and the larger Continental Congress modified it. Oh, and John Adams would eat his liver, and did almost, literally, when Thomas Jefferson kind of grabbed most of the credit for what was a group effort. And we might talk about that just a bit. But that's July 4th, and you all know that's a special day. Some of you may know that June 14 is a special day. We call it Flag Day. I don't know what happened, actually. I think it was actually the first time the American flag was hoisted aboard a ship, but don't quote me on that. September 17th, we haven't got to the 19th yet, is Constitution Day because in 1787, a group of folks meeting in Independence Hall, I think I got a picture of that up here somewhere. And come back. There's Independence Hall today. Released a plan They had been meeting behind closed doors for several months. A group of delegates selected up and down the continent, presided at a conclave, a constitutional convention, we call it, presided over by General George Washington, attended, among others, by the great Benjamin Franklin, Dr. Franklin. James Madison was there, Alexander Hamilton was there, but not John Adams, not Thomas Jefferson. They were off in France, Jefferson chasing women and Adams keeping an eye on Jefferson. And so on September 17th, after months of deliberation, closed-door deliberation, they make public, they publish a plan for how the United States should be governed going forward. Because the existing alliance among the 13 states that had unitedly declared their independence in 1776 wasn't working so well. Beginning actually, even before the Declaration of Independence, the Continental Congress starts to draft a kind of a blueprint for intercolonial, now interstate coordination, a kind of NATO-like alliance, a kind of EU alliance. They begin to draft that even before the Declaration of Independence is made public. It's called the Articles of Confederation. It's a kind of treaty, a league, and it's ratified by all 13 states in 1781, but it's failing. It's just not accomplishing its purposes at all. And so delegates from across America, although Rhode Islanders don't show up, meet in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 to try to draft a new plan, presided over by George Washington, aided especially by Ben Franklin, at least rhetorically. These are the two people who are known across the world and across America. No one's ever heard of James Madison or Alexander Hamilton. So now it's September 17th, and they go public with the plan. And it begins with, so that's Independence Hall, and that's where they met. It's the same place, actually, where an earlier Congress, that we call the Continental Congress, had met in 1774 and 1775 and 1776, that generated the Declaration of Independence, which was drafted basically in the same hall. And now they have a new plan. This is the National Constitution Center. That's where the debate happened 9 days ago. And you see that the words from the preamble there, we the people. That's how their new plan begins. And the words are so familiar to you all that you don't pause to understand what they're really saying and doing. Okay? Nothing actually has been done yet. It's just a plan. It has no legal effect whatsoever. It's just a group of people meeting behind closed doors. But on September 17th, a year begins in which this plan is going to be put to a series of votes up and down the continent. And if successful, it's getting a little ahead of itself. It says, we, the people of the United States, not a few secret delegates, do, ... for a whole bunch of reasons. They actually give reasons to form a more perfect union, for common defense, for general welfare, to secure the blessings of liberty to themselves and us, their posterity, whether we lineally descend from them, as some of you may, or you don't. I don't. So they come up with this plan, and they're doing it for certain reasons, and they're telling us the reasons. Law rarely tells you the reasons. It just says, do this, don't do that. But here they're actually saying, we, the people of the United States, for a whole bunch of reasons, but now here's the key thing, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. We're going to do something. We're going to vote on the thing. And if we vote yes, we will have just done it. These words are not mere words. They're actually a deed, a doing, an ordainment, an establishment. Some words have that almost magic capacity to bring into existence a state of affairs. If you say in a certain context, I agree, you've just agreed. I accept in a contract, you just accept. For the young people here, at a certain moment in your life, you may, at a certain point, say, I do. be very careful at that moment, because you will have just done it. My wife and I just celebrated last week our 35th anniversary. But the saying was the doing. We do. That year begins on September 17th, 1787. We mark the 234th anniversary of that, or something like that. I haven't checked the math. Maybe that's a little wrong, but it's close. But okay. And then what happened on September 19th? I'm going to come back to the National Constitution Center, which is a really cool place. Newspapers begin to publish it, these are publishers making public, publishing for a public, for a republic, for a democratic society, what the plan is. It's short, not so judges 200 years later can make stuff up. That's not why it's short. It's short so that way back when, ordinary people could read it start to finish and decide whether they were for it or against it. Wow. The world, nothing like that had happened in the world. And the publishers, you see, they're free to publish it or not. No one's telling them what to do. There is freedom of speech and the press before there's even a First Amendment. There are no amendments yet. Okay? But there's freedom of the press. And the publishers just intuit that first sentence is actually a pretty important sentence. If Joe Biden had been around back then, he would have whispered to Barack Obama that this was a big effing deal. Okay, that's what he said about Obamacare, but it was a hot mic. So they put in, that is publishers up and down the continent, many of them choose to put that preamble in especially big words because they understand this is a big deal. Now, that's September 19th. Okay, that's today, way back when. So 237 years ago or whatever. So we meet on this anniversary today of the Constitution going public in newspapers after the plan was released on September 17th. It takes a couple of days for the newspapers to compose it, to put it into type. And so that's, and this is this is chapter 1. My friend David, he was very, very generous, but he said one thing, truthfully, it's not true. No one who has ever met me would ever, in the same sentence, put my name and the word modest, okay? So I'm not, okay? I try to be honest, but I'm not modest. But a book that I wrote in 2005 called America's Constitution, a Biography, this is chapter 1, with the very pretentious title, In the Beginning, okay? But I do believe that this is the beginning of the modern world. And here's why. Because there had been self-government. Today, we look back and we see many of the limitations, the exclusions. Women aren't part of the voting process, except maybe a few in New Jersey, a few unmarried women. And there's slavery in every state, although it's in the process of being eliminated in half of America, the northern half. And there are property qualifications. And if we judge it by the standards of today, 234 years later, it sucks. Okay, but today hasn't yet happened. Okay, and today won't happen if this day hasn't preceded it. When you compare September 1787 to September 1786, or September 1785, or 1685, 1585, all the 85s back to the dawn of time, here's what you'll see. For in most places, at most times, the people are basically governed by thugs. The world is a world of kings, emperors, czars, sultans, Mughal lords, tribal chieftains, precursors of Adolf Hitler and Pol Pot and Mao and Ho and Putin. That's the world. There are few self-governing societies that manage to spring up, but then they flicker out. Athens, classical Athens, 5 centuries before Christ, in the age of Pericles and Socrates. They operate democratically under a thing called the Clisthenic Constitution, but then they fade. They are not, and they're smaller than Ann Arbor. Pre-imperial Rome has its day, but it flickers out. These regimes, and there are very few of them, do not extend over wide swaths of space. They do not bring together different kinds of people. They tend to just, in pre-imperial Athens, before the Caesars, and then before the fall of Rome, or pre-imperial Rome, or ancient Athens, they are people who worship the same god or gods, speak the same language, same culture, and they aren't able to basically survive for long stretches of time. They fail because of internal dissension, or they're unable to repel external attack. So that's the history of the world. Let's look at 1787 now, September 19th. You look around the world. Who governs themselves other than Americans in the wake of the American Revolution? The Brits, to some extent, although they have a king that no one voted for, and a House of Lords, hereditary House of Lords. We're not talking about Sir Paul and Sir Mick, and Sir Keith, and Sir Elton, who get there because they're talented. No, we're talking about all the sirs just being, and the lords being people who were born to the thing. So a hereditary monarch, who might be an idiot. I tend to think so, but you can decide for yourself. A hereditary House of Lords. And there are juries that people do vote. Maybe 1 in 10, 1 in 15 freeborn British men could vote. No more than that before the reforms of the 1830s and the 19-teens. But Britain has some self-government. There's Switzerland. And people vote in Switzerland, but truthfully, they're more sheep than people, and they don't have banks or anything else really yet to attract any external attack. So they're basically self-governing because no one bothers with them. They're not worth bothering over. Don't tell that to your Swiss friends, but the Dutch are in the process of losing their self-government. That's it for the planet, okay? Modern day China, Russia, India, Central Europe, Western Europe, the rest of the Americas, there's no real self-government. And then we, the people of the United States, did in actual fact launch a constitution that got voted on across the continent. Even the places that had democratic constitutions didn't have democratic constitution-making processes. Typically had one guy claiming some divine mandate, the lawgiver, Solon, Lycurgus, a Moses-like person handing down the law from on high, even if the law was tolerably democratic. The British never reduced basic principles to a single composite text, much less a composite text that was short, much less one that could be adopted by Parliament or read by ordinary English persons and voted on. Nothing like that ever happened. They have Magna Carta. Magna Carta from 1215 or whatever. It's not even in English. No one understands it at the time, and it's just a battlefield truce between one big thug and a bunch of medium-sized thugs who basically have a thuggish, truce of a certain sort. That's the Great Charter, okay? And to repeat, no one actually at the time can even read it. It's not in the vernacular. So the Swiss don't have a constitution that people vote on, and neither did the Brits. In 1776, no one votes directly on the Declaration of Independence. None of the state constitutions that launched that year were specially voted on. Now, Massachusetts, the Articles of Confederation from 1777 to 81, as they're gestating, 1776 to 81, were not voted on in any special way by the citizenry. In 1780, it is true, Massachusetts launches a state constitution that actually came before ordinary people meeting in town meetings. That's the first. New Hampshire follows suit, in effect. They started the process earlier, but they didn't really finish up until 1784. But apart from that, which are kind of, in retrospect, little teeny tiny dress rehearsals for the big show in 1787, 88, no one had ever done anything like this. So that's why I say in the beginning, because our modern world begins in this year, beginning in mid-September, and goes for the next 9 months or so. I call it the hinge of human history, the year that changed everything, because before this, there was almost no self-government anywhere. And today, even though the world is struggling and it's imperfect, half the world by population and land mass is plus or minus self-governing, often very, very broadly on an American constitutional model. In that, let's take India. I'm going to say a little bit more about my folks. They're from India. My mom passed away 2 years ago. My dad's still around. He's 95. When they are born in undivided India under the British Raj, they are governed by a king halfway across the world that no one voted for in the Indian subcontinent, a parliament that no one voted for, just like the American colonials. And my dad's still around. That's in a lived lifetime. And today, it's imperfect, but it's 1 billion people with a written constitution, many religions, many languages, moderately free and fair elections, a court, a Bill of Rights, some religious freedom. It's utterly imperfect. So was our regime today in the United States, by the way, but on an American constitutional model. That's 1 billion with a B people. And Japan actually has a democracy of sorts that it didn't have 100 years ago. And there used to be an absolutist tyrant who sat on the throne in Paris. And now France has a pretty good republic. I don't think it's as impressive, frankly, as California. We'll talk about why. California is better to its racial minorities and ethnic minorities than the French are, linguistic minorities. Central Europe is struggling to be free, whether we talk about Hungary or the Czech Republic or Poland or Ukraine. It's not perfect, but half the world today, you see, is self-governing in a way that wasn't true on September 19th, 1787. So that's what we mark. We mark the beginning of the modern world, a democratic world. I think democracies pretty much, it's very uneven, but we won the last century, and I still like our odds going forward for all our problems. So that's what we mark today, this hinge of human history, this year that changed everything. The first sentence, I think, of the book, once I start with this utterly pretentious title, it started with a bang. And I mean the Big Bang. This was before Sheldon Cooper and Kutrapali. I wrote this book back in 2005. But the Big Bang gave, since I'm here with a philosopher of physics, I'm told a kind of, it created a certain dynamic that has unfolded. It created a certain explosion that is still radiating out across the cosmos. And I think this remarkably democratic act that happened here in America in 1787, 88 has continued ever since then to radiate out in space across the world. And in time, the American project has actually gotten better over time. And these are consequences of the Big Bang. What's the first thing ordinary people, when they see this thing on September 19th in the newspapers, first thing they say is, dudes, you forgot the rights. Where are the rights? State constitutions have bills of rights. Why didn't you have one? And we can talk about why. The answer is they were tired. They made a mistake. They did. That happens to human beings, okay? But immediately people actually in that ratification process say, we'll vote yes, but we want a Bill of Rights, okay? And a Bill of Rights is added. We're making amends from the beginning. We're beginning an amendment process even in the course of saying, yes, we do to the project. And then later generations are going to say, we have to get rid of slavery because all persons really are created equal, and the Constitution will do that in a 13th Amendment in Mr. Lincoln's era. And a 14th Amendment will promise equal citizenship, black, white, male, female, full civil rights, and then political rights for African Americans. That's the 15th Amendment. Voting rights, political rights for women, a 19th Amendment. In my lifetime, I'm going to talk a little bit more about my lifetime in just a second, getting rid of poll tax disfranchisement, promising, guaranteeing voting rights for young adults, because if you're old enough to fight in Vietnam, maybe die there, you're old enough to vote on whether we should be there in the first place. The amendments in general have made amends. They've made the project better, more free, more equal. The 18th Amendment prohibition wasn't so great. It limited liberty, and it was repealed shortly thereafter with the 21st Amendment. So that's why we're meeting now. That's why September 17th is Constitution Day. I've adjusted it just a little bit to get you to the 19th, since we're meeting on the 19th. And so you can see, we could think about this as Constitution Day meets a free press. You see that? September 19, 1787. That's the first published version of the United States Constitution, and they published the whole thing, start to finish, because it's short, so that people can read it and decide whether they were for it. See, back then there were these things, they were called newspapers. Okay, and for the students in the audience, there was this thing called reading, and some people actually did it. And I'm joking because you're here. It's the people who are playing frisbee, who need to hear this. Okay, and today, I encourage you to go to this place. It's 3 blocks away from Independence Hall. It's on axis with it, the National Constitution Center. How many people have been there? Anyone who was there who didn't like it, and be honest, raise your hand. I think it's a really cool place. I encourage you to go there. There was a presidential debate there last week, in case you missed it. And cards on the table, I'm ridiculously, a fan of this place because I helped found it. It didn't, when I was your age, it didn't exist, and now it does. And it exists in part because we need to remember who we are as a people. And the Constitution is central to that. I'm about to end. We're going to have a conversation very, very soon. I'm going to tell you who I am, and then you're going to ask me questions, and we're going to talk. Here's why we have to know the story of our Constitution. Because without it, we don't have anything else in common. We don't have race in common. Many races and ethnicities here in America. That's not true in Sweden. It's just a fine democracy. We don't have religion in common. Some of our families came very recently. I'll tell you the story of my family in just a couple of minutes. Other families came hundreds of years ago. Some with bullwhips in their hands, some in chains. We don't have the kind of cultural homogeneity where we can say, well, everyone here has read the great, the canonical texts of this culture. In Germany, everyone has read Goethe or something like that. In England, everyone has mastered Shakespeare. We don't have that here. So I think the only thing really that we do have is a constitution that we're all going to have to agree to follow. And we need to know the story behind the Constitution, because that's what makes us Americans. Okay? And without that commonness, that one thing that we have in common, I think we're Beirut. And in case you missed it, Beirut is not a very nice place today. We are in a state of anarchy. Gaza, Ukraine, the world is filled with places where Hobbes would say it's a war of all against all. There is no, law, order, peace, elections that are followed. Life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And we don't have that. We, in general, when you go to bed tonight, you're not worried so much about whether a bomb is going to fall on your house. That's not true for many people around the world. And I think it's true of us in part because of this Constitution that has served the people on pretty well. And we can talk about how it ill-served a whole bunch of folks, slaves. We can talk about Native Americans. We can talk about anything you want, okay? Because I want this to be a conversation. But the one thing that we have in common, it seems to me, is the Constitution and the story behind it, which is why I write these long, boring books that my fellow citizens actually, I think, need to experience. That would be reading, or you could listen to it on audiobooks, to know the common story. And here's what you won't learn from the books, my politics. I'll tell you right now, just to be candid, but these books are not about what I personally think about things. So, for example, if you want to ask me about guns, they're pretty important here in Michigan. I've never had a gun in my house, but I think you have a right to have one in yours, and we can talk about why, and I can show you some pictures. I'm personally pro-choice for reasons largely articulated by Kamala Harris, but I think Roe versus Wade was actually an unpersuasive opinion. My personal views are not the same thing as what's actually in the Constitution. My brother clerked for Harry Blackmun, who wrote Roe versus Wade. But just agreeing with the results isn't the same thing as, oh, it really is in the Constitution, just the way it would have been if I and only I had written it. Okay, we have to talk about us, we the people. The book, I've donated some copies to you all. It's called The Words That Made Us, and us is a pun. It can mean the U.S., but it's also a gesture to we, the people of the United States. At the beginning of this book, the subtitle is America's Constitutional Conversation, and we're about to have a conversation, 1760 to 1840. And at the beginning of that narrative in 1760, there is no we. There's no sense of Americanness at all. There are people who live in Massachusetts, and there are people who live in South Carolina, and there are people who live in New York, and they don't even talk to each other. They talk to London, but they don't talk to each other very much. But by 1776, they've actually united to declare themselves free and independent states. And by 1781, they've created a framework for coordination, a kind of NATO-EU. And by 1788, the end of this year that changed everything, they have created a more perfect union that's really pretty astonishing. It's not perfect, but it's more perfect than went before, and it is amendable, called the Constitution of the United States. And that's the story that I tell in the first part of the book. The book goes from 1760 to 1840. It's the first of a projected 3-volume trilogy telling you, my fellow citizens, the history of us as a people. So this is the Fellowship of the Ring. I just finished The Two Towers, which is called Born Equal. It's the story from 1840 to 1920. And then Volume 3, which since I just finished the second one last week, I just started the third. It's called Earth's Best Hope, and it's about America from 1920 forward. Okay, I think I've said almost everything that I wanted to say. I've shown you this picture of the National Constitution Center, which is beautiful, and shown you a little bit about, just shown you Independence Hall, where it all happened. So finally, I just need to say a little bit more about myself because I'm very grateful you invited me. Because speaking of in the beginning, I, in every way, began at the University of Michigan. My parents were born in undivided India under the British Raj, and they didn't know each other. They meet in Ann Arbor, Michigan, pursuing their medical studies at the U of M. And this is where they get married. And I assume, although I never asked, this is where I was conceived. And this is where I was born, 66 years and 2 weeks ago. And as I'm walking around, my mom passed away 2 years ago. This is the first time I've been back. I'm really feeling her spirit here. This is where I began, and I'm very grateful that you have invited me to come talk about how we began as a people and where we are now and where we need to go. And this next election, in case you missed it, we have an election coming up, and it might be decided right here. And if you want to talk about that, we can. We can talk about the presidency. We can talk about rights. We can talk about slavery. We can talk about Native Americans. So the floor is yours. There are microphones here. You're going to ask me questions. I'm going to try to answer them as best I can. You might not agree with the answer. That's fine. We Americans don't agree on everything, but we have to talk to each other. We talked ourselves into nationhood with conversations, okay? People didn't just vote on the Constitution. They talked about it for a year, and some people were opposed to it, and they weren't voted off the island. They actually said, we should have a Bill of Rights, and people said, actually, maybe you're right. So here's what's astonishing. People oppose the Constitution, and they later become President of the United States. James Monroe, Vice President of the United States, George Clinton, Elbridge Gerry. Justices on the Supreme Court, Samuel Chase. The Constitution wins by this much in a bunch of states. In New York, it passes 30-27. Here's the astonishing thing. The losers acquiesced. They lost fair and square, and they said, okay, actually, that was a fair election, and you won. But actually, we're not really quite satisfied, and you should listen to us because you can't govern 51-49. Actually, that's not going to work. Oh, and the majority was smart enough to actually listen. And then we got, a bipartisan, border reform bill. No. We didn't. We can't do that today. And why can't we? Okay? Because we did it before. We've done it before. I want you to see the stories about how that in fact happened, because this is not the Lord of the Rings fantasy. Stuff actually really happened, and you should know how it happened and who did it and who stepped back sometimes from the brink and how people came together who didn't agree on everything, because welcome to the world. So that's why I want you to read the books, listen to the podcast episodes. We have them weekly. We have conservatives on the podcast from time to time. We have liberals on the podcast from time to time, and we try to talk to each other. We don't have food fights. But what would you like to talk about? I've tried to invert this so that there's more time, and we have a lot of time, for conversation. And so that's why I've tried to keep my formal remarks kind of a little bit shorter. So come to the mics.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Can everyone hear our friend?
Is it on?
Elise will help us. She's very helpful. They're very helpful. Thank you, Elise.
Thank you. Freedom of the press, social media platforms.
Yes.
Where do we draw the line?
Well, freedom of the press is a freedom for those who own the press. The Constitution recognizes rights against government. And so most of the clauses of the First Amendment are quite egalitarian. Let's go through them. Freedom of speech. Well, I get to speak, and you get to speak, and I get to speak actually. And now free exercise of religion. Well, I can have my idea of the divine, and you can have yours, and each of us has one equal soul. In a petition, I suppose you could sign, there's freedom of petition. You could sign your name 20 times, but it's going to be counted once in the petition. There's freedom of assembly. That means in a gathering, each of us has one body that shows up. Freedom of the press isn't quite like that. It's about printing presses. And not everyone at the time has a printing press. Today, you all do. It's called this. And you can upload stuff to the world immediately. You can take an image of some police officer misbehaving or something. You can record this and push if I knew how to work it, but push a button, and in an hour later, Taylor Swift is Instagramming it to everyone in the world or something like that. Okay, we all today have printing presses. Okay, but that wasn't true at the founding, and so I'm very old-fashioned and formalistic. Printers are allowed to print what they want, and they don't have to print other stuff. That's what freedom of the press is. And Ben Franklin's a printer, and he doesn't just print everything. He chooses what to print. And these guys are newspaper people, and Thomas Jefferson writes certain things but doesn't write other things. And that's true for Alexander Hamilton. I'll show you a picture of Alexander Hamilton here in just a second. No, that's actually Lynn Miranda, but he is Alexander Hamilton. And the book is dedicated in part to Lynn Miranda. These guys are newspaper people. They publish pamphlets, but freedom of the press means you get to put forth your ideas about things, and other people can put forth their ideas. And if you don't like X, stay off X. Go on Instagram or TikTok, or I don't even know what the hell these things actually are, because I stay off all of them. But, every day I do read mainstream media and across the spectrum, not because I have to, but because I actually think America works better if we actually try to listen to people across the spectrum. So I check out the New York Times, and I check out the Washington Post, and I check out Fox. And I do draw a line. Some of the crackpot, outlets, they've lost credibility with me, and life is short, and so I spend less time on them. But freedom of the press is a right against the government of private institutions and entities. I'll say it one other way. Let's take free exercise of religion. The government can't have religion, but I get to have one. Okay? The government shouldn't have a sexual preference or an orientation, but I get to have one. So freedom of the press is a freedom of the people who own the press. Now, in fact, I don't believe that there's only one outlet out there. And so if you don't like Elon Musk, just ignore, his platform. And he's doing a pretty good job of encouraging that, because he's lost about 60% of the market cap since he bought the thing. So I'm skeptical of the idea that government should tell these outlets what to cover and what not to cover, in part because I don't trust the government to do that fairly. I don't trust any individual media mogul to do the right thing, but there are more than one of them. And in 10 years, they're going to be a different group, just as 10 years ago there was a different group. This is what Schumpeter calls, creative destruction. And at any given moment, in theory, it might be better if we could try to, regulate them. But as a practical matter, I don't trust the government so much. The Constitution tells me not to trust the government so much. And if we just wait, they'll start to compete against each other in all sorts of ways. Apple will go against Google, will go against Microsoft. And that's better than the government trying to tell printers what to print and what not to print. And then we'll just alternate.
My question is about legal textualism. You mentioned classical Athens, and it was the Athenian playwright Euripides who said that when the laws are written down clearly, only then can the strong man and the weak man be equal. I think this is a fundamental tenet of Western democracy and Western law, is this idea of specifically inscribed laws. And you mentioned the thugs and strongmen that dominate historical narratives. And I'd observe that in those countries, in those societies, those are societies where the laws are able to be loosely interpreted and easily bent against the will of the people or bent to marginalize certain groups. And so I suppose, how do we reconcile the issue where when the laws are incredibly specific, sometimes that's a hindrance to progress and a hindrance to protecting our rights, while not wanting to create these strong men within the courts who can bend the law to fit ideology, bend the law to fit their whims. This is really an issue, I think, that's very difficult to navigate, and I was hoping you could shed some light on it.
Very impressive statement. So the taxpayers of Michigan should be very pleased. Yeah, I think when I was your age, the only thing, if someone asked me to use Euripides in a sentence, I think I might have said, this is from The Simpsons. Euripides pants, Eumenides pants. But so let's start with the fact that the Constitution is written for ordinary people. It's short so that people could read it, start to finish. and debate it over a year, discuss it with their family, with their friends, their neighbors, their fellow parishioners, debate it with their political adversaries. So the first thing, I think, to do, and most statutes aren't that way. They're very complicated. They're crafted by lobbyists. They're all sorts of, they're sometimes impenetrable by design. Think the tax code and all the regulations affiliated with the tax code. You know, when you compare the tax code, which is at least this, just even the major laws, and then the code of federal regulations accompanying it, and you compare it to this, okay? And John Marshall, in a case called McCulloch versus Maryland, says that the Constitution cannot partake of the prolixity of a legal code. It would never be understood by the public mind, okay, by the public, by the people. So it came from the people, it has to be voted on by the people, and they wrote it so that it could be read. There's still going to be ambiguity. Welcome to the nature of language and the universe. There are going to be all sorts of hard questions. But they did write it so that people could read it. So the first step is encouraging all of your friends to read the thing and to reread it, to read it fairly regularly. Your friends, my friends, are much better at memorizing and reciting some of their favorite songs than they are they couldn't recite, most of our friends, even a paragraph from the Constitution. Okay? And they can actually recite at great length, you know, other favorite texts of theirs, including, you know, favorite songs or scriptures. Okay? So we have to read it, encourage other people to read it. And if we do that, I think it helps us a little bit keep a check on judges who might be tempted to make stuff up, as they have over the years. Let's take, and this is the new book, the Dred Scott case. Dred Scott says blacks can't be citizens, even if free, even if born free, even if your father was born free, even if your grandfather was born free in Massachusetts and fought at Bunker Hill and voted on the Constitution itself as free blacks did. Let me show you. There are various versions of the Battle of Bunker Hill this is the death of General Warren at Bunker Hill. There are different versions of this. I'm going to show you the one at the Yale University Art Gallery because it's the nicest. You see the person on the far right there? That's a black person. There were black people at Bunker Hill, okay? But Roger Taney and a majority of the Supreme Court said, oh, black people can't ever, ever, ever be citizens. He just made that up. He pulled it out of his judicial ass. He did. And he also said that the federal government could not prohibit slavery in the territories. And you look at the text and you say, it says the exact opposite. It says Congress has plenary power to make all needful, well, we can look at it together. My best recommendation for reading the Constitution, if you really want to get into it, would be the Interactive Constitution from the National Constitution Center. It's online, and for each clause, they actually have a couple of different essays. One written by a liberal, one written by, actually three. A liberal essay interpreting the clause, a conservative essay interpreting the clause, and one that the two of them came up together. Here's what we agree on. And then, so if you just look here, so hold on, U.S. Constitution. So let's just look together at Article 4. So Article 4 says that, I got to find it here. Here we go. The Congress shall have power to dispose and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory and other property belonging to the United States. Okay? Congress has plenary power over the territories. Now a history point. I'm an originalist of a certain sort. I'm not just going to look at dictionaries. What did the first Congress do? Among the first 10 statutes passed was a thing called they enacted a statute called the Northwest Ordinance, which codified something that the Confederation Congress was doing in New York as the folks in Philadelphia were meeting. They actually, under the Confederation, passed an ordinance prohibiting slavery in the territories. We could look it up together. It's short, and you're going to recognize its language. Okay, whoops. So if we just look up a Northwest Ordinance, and its text, and let's see if we can just pull it up here. Maybe the National Archives will give us a good version of this. Here's a transcript. Okay, what does it say? It says, "There shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in said territory, otherwise than as punishment for crimes whereof the party shall have been duly convicted." Okay, by the way, does that language look remotely familiar to anyone? No slavery, involuntary servitude, except for punishment of crimes. You're nodding your head. Where else have you seen that language?
Amendment 13.
It's like Jeopardy. You know, could it be the third? Yes, is it the third? Yes, yes, yes. It's almost word for word the 13th Amendment. So let's go back. So you're next, my friend. So that you know this is great. We're going to go back to the Constitution. Okay, and now we're going to not get out of Article 4, and we're going to go to Amendment 13. This is the amendment that ends slavery, the abolition of slavery. "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist." And that's almost word for word, you see, the Northwest Ordinance. Even before America said, yes, we do, the Confederation Congress has done this. And Washington signed into law. It's one of the first 10 statutes ever adopted, a codification of this under the new Constitution. Tawney comes along and says, oh, you can't prohibit slavery in the territories. Well, George Washington thought you could. The entire first Congress thought you could. Many of these people had been there at Philadelphia. They'd been involved in the ratification process. They thought you could. And more, the Missouri Compromise prohibits slavery north of a certain line. Tawney is just making all this stuff up. And then there's nobody from nowhere, like you. You know, he's a good look, and actually he's not good looking. You're good looking. He's not good looking, but he's very muscular and he's tall and he knows how to read. And his name is Abraham Lincoln. And he says, like, you just made that up. And he goes up and down the Midwest actually saying, Tawney made that up. We call those the Lincoln-Douglas debates. He gets more votes in Illinois, but he doesn't quite, you know, for electoral college-like reasons. There's an indirect election of senators at the time. He gets more votes, but he actually doesn't get elected to the Senate. But 2 years later, he runs again, and he wins the presidency on a platform of taking the Constitution seriously. He gives a speech, and you should read it. It's an amazing speech. It's one of the centerpieces of the new book that I just finished called Born Equal. It's a speech at a place in New York called Cooper Institute. And he says, the framers, and he goes through them one by one by one. He's an originalist. He's a liberal originalist. Originalism is not some bad thing that only conservatives do. It's taking the Constitution seriously and the history behind it. And he says, here, this guy signed the Constitution, and he supported ending slavery in the territories. His name is George Washington. And he went through them one by one by one, okay? He wins only because there was a culture in which people actually were willing to read the Constitution, read his speech, and it took more than a little tweet to make the argument, 140 characters or whatever it is, 280 now. And so, yes, it only works. The Constitution is short so that it's a special law for all of us, but we have to read it and reread it. And we need to know the history behind it. Now, unfortunately, to know the history behind it, well, these are long books, but they'll give you a lot of the history behind it. And then, once you know that, you can run for Senate, or you can run for the House, and you actually do a good job because you will actually know what you've taken your oath to. And when the Supreme Court makes shit up, which they did, for example, in the Trump immunity case, which we can talk about, you can say, it doesn't say that at all. You just pulled a Dred Scott. When they refused to enforce, racial equality, as they did in Plessy versus Ferguson, you can say, it says it right here. It says equal, okay? I'm pro-choice, but it doesn't really, in my view, say abortion, truthfully. I wish it did, but it doesn't. So we have to keep the people in power honest. And the way we do that is by empowering ourselves. And the way we do that is by reading and rereading, especially the Constitution, including its amendments, because without the amendments, oh my gosh, it wouldn't be so good. And then conversing with our fellow citizens, and if they're doing the same thing, there's not just freedom of speech and of the press, there's kind of a duty to listen, truthfully. It can't be enforced, but we have to talk to each other. And if we don't, we die, because it's the only thing we have in common. But the Constitution is pretty impressive in its specificity and generality. And if you want a really interesting meditation on why you can't be super specific on everything because the world is too complicated, read tonight. It's a short essay. It's the Federalist number 37. I'll put it up on the screen. What are the Federalist Papers? We call them Federalist Papers. They would have called them Federalists. They're a series of 85 newspaper op-eds saying, support the Constitution, vote for the Constitution. They are anonymously published under a pseudonym Publius, but it's James Madison and Alexander Hamilton mainly, along with John Jay. The easiest online version of the Federalist is the Avalon website, which is at Yale. It's free, but I tend to use the Avalon website. And if you read the Federalist number 37, okay, it's all about how hard it is to put things into words, even if you're not trying to be weaselly about the thing. It's a very sophisticated exposition of the epistemic, ontological, I know those are big words, and linguistic difficulties of trying to be, precise, especially even when you're trying to talk about pure things in the natural world, like pi, if you're a Platonist or something. But then you get to the biological world and the social world, and does the universe have clean choice? What can you say about search and seizure? Because there's so many different kinds of search and seizure. So what you end up saying is they can't be unreasonable. Now that's something, but what does unreasonable mean, and how do you cash that out, and what's the relationship between that and warrants and probable cause? But you're interested in these interesting, difficult questions of language and communication. Read the Federalist 37. It's a short op-ed. It'll take you about 5 minutes tops to read. It's pretty profound. And what a culture. The goal is to get people to just say yes. But instead of a 280, character tweet, I hate Taylor Swift. Well, thank you very much, Donald Trump. That tells me a lot. I already knew that she didn't endorse you. This is a sophisticated, philosophically sophisticated meditation on the possibilities and limits of language. Wittgenstein, the later Wittgenstein, avant la lettre, in fascinating ways. Federalist 37. Your name is?
Hunter Ryerson.
Very impressive. What year are you in?
Freshman.
Couldn't have done that as a freshman, so thank you. Please.
Back to follow.
No, you already did. You knew the 13th Amendment, my friend. Well done.
My question came out of something you said about half an hour ago. The word sucked came up.
The word?
Sucked, S-U-C-K-E-D,
yes.
When it referred to the Constitution as originally written sans amendments.
Yes.
And
I have to reach the younger generations.
Naturally. No, I'll use a stronger word because I could well imagine somebody coming with 2024 sensibilities and understandings of the world in general as seeing this and understanding what it meant and say, well, this is an abomination.
Yes.
Well, women can't vote, and
Yes.
people of color, and
Right.
on and on, judging it
By
as
today.
somebody now.
Yes.
And then you also mentioned Lincoln and Shakespeare and Washington, and in a similar vein, we have in recent years seen similar judgments of folks 160 years ago, 400 years ago, judged by 2024
Cancel
or 2020.
culture. Yes.
Well, I don't.
Well, I'll
wanna
say it,
yeah,
even
yeah.
though you did, but this is the risk.
And I'm wondering if you could speak to that, because it seems very
Great.
fraught.
Yes, it is. So the Constitution is an intergenerational project. It begins in September 1787, but it's the Big Bang. It continues to explode and grow. You have to focus on the amendments, and you have to then think at least 3 different ways. One, think about it at the time. Think about something at the time. Okay, 1787 compared to 1786. And if you're not thinking that, at least in part, someone in the history department here would say you're thinking anachronistically, out of time. You're not judging. And let's take women voting. Women had never voted anywhere in large numbers in any democracy or republic anywhere in the world. They didn't vote in Athens. They didn't vote in Rome, in Florence, in Switzerland, in the Dutch Republic, in any of the colonies, in Britain, I think I said, except a few in New Jersey. Now, and why? Okay, so I'm going to do 3 time slices. What happened then, how we should think about things today, and what we want the future to look like. 3 different lenses. So, for one, there's not secret ballot, and there are marriage rules in place that allow men to beat their wives. This is called, well, they don't call it that. They say the law of moderate chastisement. I write about all this in my books. And sometimes it's associated with the rule of thumb, which means that he can beat her as long as he doesn't use a stick thicker than a thumb. It's not clear it's his thumb, the judge's thumb, a reasonable person's thumb. So, if there's not secret ballot, and she's married, she has to vote the way he tells her to vote. So that's not very much that's not a very feminist thing. Here's another thing. Forever, going back to the ancient Athenians, arms bearing and voting were linked. Those who fought for the polis, for the republic, bore arms and voted, and those who voted bore arms. Well, women don't fight, so women don't vote. There were a whole bunch of other things also going on. But just to repeat, women never voted before. And then the interesting question is how women end up getting the vote, because they can't vote themselves the vote. And I tell that story in the book, Born Equal. I have 4 main characters. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Frederick Douglass, and of course Abe Lincoln. And I'm telling the story of how black equality and women's equality come to become the dominant themes of the era eventually between 1840 and 1920. We start with slaves groaning in chains, millions, black, male and female, and go through the abolition of slavery, civil rights for all, voting rights for blacks, then voting rights for black men, then voting rights for women. It's an astonishing story. And by 1920, women are voting equally everywhere. Okay, and that story, human beings are acting, and the Constitution, they're doing it through the Constitution. It doesn't end in 1787. The project kind of begins then. So you have to think about the world as it was when these constitutions were adopted or when these amendments were adopted. 19th Amendment seems really amazing, right? Women vote, women get the suffrage. But from a certain point of view, it sucked because, of course, women didn't vote everywhere on whether women could vote. If they did, you wouldn't have needed the 19th Amendment quite so much. So, the people who are deciding to give women the vote initially are largely men. Where do women get the vote first in America? In all of America, where do they get the vote first? Other than this little blip in New Jersey that is... so the only women who could vote in New Jersey were unmarried women. And unmarried women generally... another thing. Married women aren't allowed to own property in their own right. And their property qualifications. So if you don't own property in your own right because of the laws of coverture, which haven't changed, and you don't bear arms, and he can beat you if you don't vote the right way and there's not secret ballot, those are a bunch of reasons, but you need to know that world, to understand why certain things didn't happen yet. Then I'm going to have to tell you, well, why did they in 1920? Oh, well, we actually have wars in which women are participating as equal economic supporters, Rosie the Riveter, avant la lettre, and we've changed the rules for married women state by state, so now they actually can own property in their own right, and we've changed the rules of coverture on whether he can beat her, and we have secret ballots called the Australian ballot. It comes in. So you need to understand, all these things. But take the 19th Amendment, women don't get to vote everywhere on whether women vote. But why is it? Where did the first women vote in significant numbers? Because New Jersey, it isn't quite. Anyone know? Wyoming. That's right. And my friend Elizabeth knows. And do you know, by the way, the two nicknames for the state of Wyoming? Wyoming, most states have one nickname. Okay. This is the Wolverine state, presumably, right? California is the Golden State. Okay, Nevada's the Silver State. New York's the Empire State. Huh?
Great Lakes State.
Oh, this is the Great Lakes State? Okay. See, I haven't been in Ann Arbor in a while. Okay. But, thank you. Wyoming actually has two official nicknames. It's the Equality State and the Cowboy State. No, you look it up. Now, why and Wyoming as a territory gives women the vote in 1869-70, and then it's admitted as a state in 1890. It's the first state. Why Wyoming? Why is that the first place where women get the vote? What? That's right. No, not hardly any people. No women. In 1869, the men outnumber the women 6-1. And they are, in a word, desperate. They are so desperate. And not because they just have to talk politics with, females. Their motivations are a little more mixed than that. Okay? But they're so willing to... So the un-PC part of the story is that men do this because they want to attract women. The PC part of the story is they actually have to ask themselves what would attract women. They have to ask themselves, what do women want? Which is a question that has perplexed men forever, in all societies at all times. But here's the thing. They actually, and the Greeks, they're great, comedies about this in ancient Athens. They actually at a certain point say, well, the women say they want the vote. They say they want equal pay for equal work. What if we gave it to them? Okay, so they're taking seriously the likes of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and others. So it's a really, and then the sky doesn't fall. Okay, and Idaho and Colorado and Utah come on board. This is the Brandeisian idea of laboratories, and the sky doesn't fall. So telling the story, how reform happened. Why did it happen when it did? Why not before? Why not afterwards? Why this much and not that much? Why did black men get the vote so much before white women? And one reason is because Denzel Washington fights, alongside Matthew Broderick in, the Massachusetts 54th, and women aren't yet on the battlefield. That's part of it, and there are other political reasons that are explained in Born Equal, because black voting is going to help the Republican Party and women voting isn't going to make a difference because it's going to cancel out. The women are probably going to vote pretty much because there isn't yet a massive gender gap the way there is today in likely presidential voting, okay? So 3 time periods. What was the world then? And you need to just understand that, okay? Then, is the world the same today or different? Maybe they had we'll talk about why they had the Electoral College if you want to know, and some of the reasons are disgusting. But maybe today the Electoral College might make sense for a different set of reasons. You have to think about what the world was then. Guns were different then. So what the world was then, if you're talking about the Second Amendment or something, what the world is today, and what you want the world of the future to be. They're thinking about the blessings of liberty. They say it in the preamble, for themselves and, quote, our posterity, for ourselves and our posterity. So you have to think about all through, what world do you want to bequeath to the next generation? I believe that almost every generation has actually made amends and made the system better. I think the Constitution was better than what went before. I actually think American independence was better than the Brits. That's in the beginning of this book, The Words That Made Us, because I think George III was a nitwit. So I think the American Declaration of Independence, independent America, was better. And I think the Constitution was better than the Articles of Confederation for reasons I'll explain. And then the Bill of Rights made it better still. And then Lincoln's generation made it better still. And the progressives who gave an income tax amendment and direct election of senators and women's suffrage, the 19th Amendment, make it better still. And in my lifetime, the 1960s, we get rid of poll tax disfranchisement and let 18-year-olds vote. So I think many previous generations have actually made amends in their amendments, made the thing better. Now that's our job for the future. So you have to look at 3 time slices: why people did, and who was in the room. To borrow from Lynn Miranda, who was in the room where it happens and who wasn't. Okay, why things happened back then, and which side would you have been on? Who would you have been? How to think about things today, and what you want the project to look like for our children and grandchildren, maybe yet unborn. All 3 you have to look at. It's complicated, so it's a great question. Did I even come close to responding? Okay. Please.
I learned recently about Horace Mann and his campaign for common schooling.
Yes.
And how he believed that the implementation or the adoption of public schooling for at least all like white men in America, no matter their status or economic standing, would break the social barriers within the developing country and kind of promote a sense of national identity. Like, he had like 2 points of like, it should be the right of the government, and also he aligned it with like Christian values to educate the youth, as well as saying that in our time of our developing country, we need to utilize education to develop a national identity and develop national values. I feel like my question is that now that education has become so contentious, and in addition to Federalist Paper 37 and how hard it is to teach about government and civic education without, I don't know, like misinterpreting something or like maybe like pushing it some type of way, what do you feel that education is still a viable way to teach the values of civic engagement and cultivate a national identity? And if so, how can we avoid the ills that Federalist Paper 37 alludes to in the difficulty of talking about government and passing it on to the next generation as they enter the electorate?
Your name is?
Sean Kelly.
Sean, great question. Every one of the first 6 presidents advocated a national university as a national mixing bowl, as a place to create a cadre of leaders. That's George Washington all the way through John Quincy Adams. George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, and John Quincy Adams all believed in a national university as a way of trying to create a sense of Americanness, especially for the creme de la creme. And there were very few national institutions at the time of the American Revolution. There were only about 9 colleges, very small, each graduating somewhere between, in a given year, 12 and 36 people. That's about it. So maybe 24 people graduate from Yale, 12 from Dartmouth, or something like that. So the 9 are the oldest 7 Ivies, all except, modern-day Ivies, except Cornell, which hasn't been born yet, plus William and Mary, and what was then called Queens College, but which today is called Rutgers. And back then they called it King's College, and it's now Columbia, and they called it the College of New Jersey, but it's now Princeton. So just a few institutions of higher learning, very few people had college degrees. And even those places tended not to be national. If you were Southern, you would go to Princeton. If you were a Yankee, you'd go to Harvard or Yale. Later on, there's one national institution that emerges. It's the Continental Army under Washington, and it creates a sense of national identity. And at the Philadelphia Convention, in 5 different, there were only 39 people who signed the Constitution, 55 people overall, and in 5 different states, actually, one of the people is one of Washington's aides de camp. Hamilton in New York, and Mifflin in Pennsylvania, and Charles Coachworth Pinckney from South Carolina, and Randolph from Virginia, and I'll remember the other one in a moment. But so there are not very many strong national unifying institutions. Later we're going to get a West Point, but that's military that's going to try to create a national identity. So you asked 2 questions. One about creating a national identity. Some people today believe in national public service for that, for young adults, either mandatory or strongly encouraged with tax incentives or something, like an American Vista or Peace Corps. I have a friend. He has created an amazing nonprofit, and he's not making money off of it himself. I'm on the board. I really admire this project. His name is David McCullough. You've heard of his grandfather of the same name, who wrote books about America, John Adams' biography, a Theodore Roosevelt biography, No Mornings on Horseback, a book called On 1776, Harry Truman biography, and other things. That's his grandfather. David McCullough, the grandson, my student, has created a not-for-profit. It's called the American Exchange Project. I'm on the board. I don't get paid for this. I didn't get paid to help found the National Constitution Center, and I only do a few of these things that I really believe in. And here's what the American Exchange Project is trying to do. Take high school kids from different schools in America and get them to first kind of become, as it were, pen pals with each other, get them to meet every week by Zoom, and then the kids from Cotulla, Texas, which is the middle of nowhere, Texas, go over to Boston and spend a week with their host families there, and the kids from Boston then go to Cotulla, Texas, to try to create just a sense that, okay, one's deep red, rural, one's deep blue, urban, one's south, one's north, but learning from each other and becoming maybe friends with each other. I think it's a really cool project. You could look it up. It's called the AEP, the American Exchange Project. Spielberg is supporting it. Lots of people, serious people are giving money. I'm giving my time. So there's that. Okay, because you asked about 2 questions about national, a sense of national identity and education. Okay. So I talked about a national university. We never had it, and one party wants to get rid of the Department of Education, and that's okay. They're entitled to have a vision, maybe that everything should be privatized or something. But the first 6 presidents believed in a national university. We didn't have one. We do get these national universities called West Point and then eventually Annapolis, but they're kind of military. Although Jefferson really wants West Point because he doesn't like war so much. He wants it to be basically a civil engineering school where you learn how to build roads and dams and irrigation systems and things like that. He creates the University of Virginia very much, but that was mainly for Virginians, and this other thing was more national and ambition. Take West Point and turn it to a place for civil engineers. Okay. And then, yes, there is a model of private schools. You mentioned the great Horace Mann. And Ben Franklin is so amazing. He's easy to underestimate just because he's the 10th child out of 17. He's the product of a second wife. He's low-born. His father's a candle maker. He's a total genius. And he writes, a self-made gazillionaire with a newspaper empire, like kind of Rupert Murdoch style. But he writes, he gives people advice, as Poor Richard, early to bed, early to rise, makes a man healthy, wealthy, wise. He's giving you good advice, like, get out of bed, okay? Do something, get off my lawn. A penny saved is a penny earned. Be frugal. He's giving people all sorts of really interesting advice as Poor Richard. He's going to actually help get the French to fund the American Revolution, without which we lose. He's contributing to an end reducing pollution, because the Franklin stove is actually less smoky and less polluting. He comes up with a lightning rod, which will mean fewer forest fires, which will be better, for the planet. He invents bifocals, without which I couldn't see a damn thing. He brings he's the American Prometheus. He brings fire from the sky and teaches Americans that static electricity is the same thing as lightning, and you can store it in Leyden jars. And wow, he believes in public lending library. He's always doing, and philanthropy. He has all sorts of, I was telling my friend David about his ideas about compound interest in philanthropy, but he also creates the idea of a secular university. The early schools are divinity schools, Harvard, Yale. They're denominational, they're congregational or Presbyterian. He says, no, we should actually have a school that isn't just about training priests in one denomination, but open to all. So there's, and we call that the University of Pennsylvania. And that's Franklin's idea. That's a great idea. Other people will have an idea for great private universities and colleges, historically black colleges and others, using private money sometimes. That's amazing, and God bless them for doing all of that. And don't forget Lincoln, because Lincoln was trying to unify us north and south and east and west with the Transcontinental Railroad. This is a guy who was less than a year's schooling his entire life. He's totally self-taught, but he reads and reads and reads and reads, and I love the guy. And they're going to cancel him in some way, so and I'm worried about that, because they won't be fair to judging him in his time, because he's not perfect. Oh my God, people back then weren't perfect. Are we perfect? What will the future think of us? Oh, we eat meat, and we haven't been maybe fair to friends who were differently gendered. And another side would say, oh, and they sanctioned the slaughter of innocent unborn human life. I don't know what the future will say, because if we don't know. And they didn't know what their future was going to be. We don't know what ours will be. But Lincoln signs into law the moral act that provides federal funding for great land-grant universities, like the University of Wisconsin. My brother was dean of the University of Illinois College of Law, the University of Minnesota. I think there may be a school or two in Michigan that benefited from the moral land grant. And the guy believes very much in education. And he believed there was a role even for the federal government in at least encouraging that sort of thing. And one bit of advice I would give to you is, if you're really interested in education and national unity, spend as much time as you can learning about Abraham Lincoln. The guy is astonishing on both of those. Really great. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you for being here. Appreciate it. To borrow a phrase, Congress sucks, both in the scheme of our broader government, in defending its own prerogatives. Ambition, counteracting ambition, is more ambition for your party instead of ambition for the institution of Congress. So when the president is of your party, administrative actions are reasonable enforcement of the law. When the president is of the opposite party, the president's actions are blatantly unconstitutional.
Right.
And then within Congress, it's been dubbed a parliament of pundits, where most members of Congress care more about getting cable news hits on Fox or MSNBC
Right.
instead of legislating.
Right?
Committees aren't actually doing legislative work.
It-
Congress passes continuing resolution after continuing resolution instead of passing an annual budget.
When
which
they
is what
even
they're
do
doing right
that, like this week,
Yeah. So Congress, both within, as an institution, members aren't legislating.
Right.
And outside of the institution, the body isn't legislating and defending its legislative prerogatives against an overzealous president. What kinds of structural changes, if any, not necessarily to the Constitution, but maybe just to how Congress functions, do you have ideas that might help
I
address
agree.
some of those issues?
And your name is?
Jeremiah.
Jeremiah, I agree, Jeremiah, with much of your diagnosis. I do. I've testified before Congress at the invitation of both parties over many years, and it's not what it used to be. There are only 100 senators. 4 of them are my students, and I'm not proud of all of them. And they're from both parties. There's Josh Hawley and Cory Booker and Mike Bennett and Chris Coons. Okay? And I have lots of members of the House that I know, and some are my students. And it was way better 20 years ago. It really was. And you're right in that they're just spending their time tweeting, and they're not actually doing serious policy work. So I agree with all of that. You also said that they're not sort of asserting their institutional prerogatives, Federalist 51, like it's really a separation of powers and parties and not powers. And you're echoing a critique of one of Elizabeth's co-authors, Rick Pildes. He writes an article in the Harvard Law Review with Darrell Levinson called Separation of Parties, Not Powers. So you're right about all of that. If you want Congress to be, better and more assertive at protecting its institutional prerogatives, the person you'll want to read is the work of another one of my students. He's written 2 books about the legislature from a constitutional point of view. His name is Josh Chaffetz. He's a Rhodes Scholar, and he wrote a book called, he's now a professor at Georgetown, Democracy's Privileged Few, and the other one is called Congress's Constitution. And he has some specific thoughts about this. I quite love him. He's a very impressive guy. There he is. And does he have a Wikipedia page? I bet he does. Yeah, because he's substantial. And Democracy's Privileged Few is about basically parliamentary law and privilege. And then the other one, Congress's Constitution, legislative authority and the separation of powers. He has some suggestions. He also has columns and the rest. So he really believes that Congress could do a lot better, and the Congress in a post-Chevron world, the Congress's Constitution. So he's the guy that you want to read on this issue. He's more expert on it than am I. I'm very proud of him. I've co-authored some things with him over the years. So that's the person that I recommend for you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. You have stressed the need and importance of amendments various times now. What do you think of the reluctance that can be observed in the general political landscape right now to actually amend the Constitution? Would you argue that it's a recent development? I imagine you would say that it's in stark contrast to the early American leaders to acknowledge the Constitution as a piece of flawed work. What do you think of the consequences, the scope of consequences that has, and what does it mean for us as a nation and our relationship with the Constitution?
Your name is? Fatima? That's a brilliant question, and you began to answer it because if it were just the Constitution's fault, we wouldn't have had many amendments ever. But we had 10 right off the bat, 12 proposals, 10 were ratified immediately, an 11th became our 27th Amendment years later. So, and there was this thing called the Reconstruction, 13, 14, 15. There was a whole cluster of amendments in the 19-teens and again in the 1960s. So if it were just the Constitution, how to explain these moments, I call it drought and drench. So drought, but then monsoon, drench. So if it were just the Constitution, how to explain the drenching moments. I tend to think it's not just the Constitution. The fundamental point is you're not going to get amendments when there's not a general consensus. Right now is a very unpromising time, perhaps for amendment, because half the country is trying to yank us very hard right, and half the country is trying to yank us very hard left. That's going to be perhaps an unpromising time for an amendment that ideally you want to reflect a certain kind of consensus because you want it to last. We've had so many close elections. The House is closely divided. The Senate is closely divided. Several presidential elections just on a knife's edge. Within individual districts, litigation because it's so close that that's not going to be forever. I'm hoping that my side will, I think there are two parties like two boxers in the 15th round, and they're both totally exhausted. And the only question is which is going to drop first, and one is going to, and we'll find out in 2 months, which will drop first. What you also asked, what are the consequences of no amendment? I'll give you some consequences. Because we're so closely divided, the Supreme Court gets to do whatever it wants, because no matter what it wants, it has so much running room, because the parties are so far apart, they're at the 25-yard lines and not the 40-yard lines. The median lawmakers in D.C., the median ones, is a bimodal distribution where, because I'm near the big house here, you've got, most of the Democrats clustering around the 25-yard line on one side and most of the Republicans around the 25-yard line on the other side, rather than the 40-yard lines, okay? And I know this isn't the best year to talk about Michigan football, perhaps, but I was paying attention last year. I really was, and wow. Okay, so when you have that kind of bimodal distribution, no matter what the Supreme Court does, one of the parties is going to kind of like it and be able to prevent its being overruled. So that gives them way too much power. That's partly what you were talking about. And the only way we can begin to restrict what I think is too much power of unelected judges, many of whom are there for too long, is that we actually, as citizens, know what the Constitution says. So when they make up immunity for ex-presidents, and they did make it up, there's more pushback from the citizenry. Okay, so that's one thing. I actually believe in judicial term limits, and I think we could do it without a constitutional amendment, and you could listen to my podcast episodes and see, how that works. I have a little essay. You could read it. It's actually in a conservative journal by the Cato Institute. I initiated this idea of term limits 20 years ago in a op-ed. I'm a Democrat, co-written by a Republican, founder of the Federalist Society, national chair of the Federalist Society, Steve Calabrese. But you could if you just put in Akhil Amar term limits, you could read this little essay about how it would work and how it would be constitutional. I think if they're too long, it goes to their heads, and so they should rotate a little bit more. But the consequence of the cause of no amendments is very, very sharp and deep and close divisions between the two major parties. I think that's the cause. And that's going to be an unpromising configuration for important amendments because people can't agree on very much. I'll tell you one thing that they did agree on, and we could have done it, and now if that's the cause, the consequence, because you also asked me about the consequence, is that gives the Supreme Court too much running room. And I think and that's not good for America, so citizens have to know more about the Constitution, and my grand plan for world domination is that they read my books and then are able to push back. And, because I'm not modest, but I'm honest. And term limits might be a little bit a part of a solution. I once testified for a constitutional amendment that actually was introduced by, I'm a Democrat, by a Republican, by the longest serving Republican senator in the history of the United States. And some Democrats actually were in favor of the thing. He's no longer with us. Who was the longest serving Republican senator in the history of America? Very great senator. No. Orrin Hatch. Who said that? Oh, yeah, Elizabeth. You should teach political science or something, you know. So, oh, you said it. I'm sorry. Okay. And your name is? Okay. Sarah. Okay. How did you know that, by the way? Good. Okay. I liked Orrin Hatch. He was a good, decent person. I'm a Democrat. He's a Republican. He introduced an amendment saying, if you come here legally, play by the rules, you become a U.S. citizen. You weren't lucky enough to be born a U.S. citizen. After a certain number of years, you should be eligible to the presidency, just like those of us who were lucky enough to be born in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And you should be eligible whether your name is Arnold Schwarzenegger and you're a Republican, or Henry Kissinger and you're a Republican, whether your name is, oh, what's her name? I know her name, just joking. Jennifer Granholm, okay, whose husband was my Yale College debate partner, Dan Mulhern, or whether your name is Madeleine Albright. So this wasn't a partisan thing. It's, you know, behind a veil of ignorance, both parties. I think it's good. I think it's more equal. Letting people who weren't lucky enough to be born here, and more democratic, giving voters more choices. You decide whether you want to vote for this person or not. And Pat Leahy said the nicest thing he ever said about Orrin Hatch, because he never said anything nice about Orrin Hatch. He said, like, in fact, I was there. Of all the horrible things that Orrin Hatch, terrible, no good things that Orrin Hatch has ever proposed, this seems to me the least horrible, no good, nasty thing that he's ever said. So I thought, like, you're never going to do better from Pat Leahy. But, Ted Kennedy, we talked about this at lunch, loved Orrin Hatch and vice versa. They disagreed about some things, but they worked together. I think we could still do that if we had leaders who honestly aimed to unify. That's maybe something. You ask your friends, do they think that would be a good amendment? Because I don't think it's a partisan thing, and behind a veil of ignorance, it could help, the future Republican. And I believe actually it will be the version of the Republicans' Dream Act, because they don't want illegals, that's what they call them. They want a wall, they want a big wall, they want an electrified wall. Did they tell you they want a wall? So they want lots of things, but they're going to have to give you some version of the Dream Act. They don't want actually people who came here illegally ever to be voters, because they think they're replacement people. They may not even love that they're citizens unless they go to the back of the line and wait their turn. But if you came legally, if you played by the rules, if you really contributed, I think, a Mitch McConnell, a Mitt Romney would say, yeah, actually, you should be eligible to the presidency under those circumstances. Mitt Romney's father, in fact, was born, as some of you know, George Romney, in Mexico. He was born of American parents, so he was actually eligible, although for Trump, no one is eligible other than Trump. John McCain wasn't because he was born in the Panama Canal Zone, and Kamala Harris because her, parents weren't citizens, and Ted Cruz because, he was born in Canada or whatever. The key, by the way, today, you don't have to be born in the United States when you read the Constitution with care. You have to be a citizen on the day you were born, whether born in the United States or outside. It says natural born citizen. Just in effect, take the word natural out. It's from the French naître, to be born. So it just means you have to be a born citizen. And they could have pulled a Springsteen and said you had to be born in the USA, but they didn't say that. It would have been very easy to say you have to be born in the USA, but they didn't say that. They said you have to be a natural born citizen, which means a born citizen. And Ted Cruz was born a citizen the day he was born, and so was John McCain, and so was actually Kamala Harris in the United States, and so was George Romney, who was Mitt Romney's father. We could do that, maybe. I think ERA, I think every Democrat would be in favor of it. I think half the Republicans, might think it's an okay idea. So I wonder why my friend Amy Klobuchar, and she is my friend, isn't introducing ERA today. So I think there still might be some things that we could agree on. But it's a great question, so thank you. Fatima.
You mentioned three characteristics of the documents that you were talking about. One is that they were short. Second was they are old. In other words, the people who wrote them couldn't possibly have even imagined the world that we live in. And the third is that in some cases, parts of them began with a phrase that gave the reason for what was to follow. I wonder if you could talk about those three characteristics with respect to the current interpretation in the Supreme Court, for example, of the Second Amendment.
Oh, I'm glad you asked. Thanks.
Thank you.
So the Second Amendment is one of the very few parts of the Constitution that actually says why. You know, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. So let's see if I can pull this up here. On almost everything, here's what I'd love you to do, because I only have so much time with you. You can just Google, just put in Akhil Amar, Second Amendment, Electoral College, you know, Constitutional Amendment or whatever. So this was a talk I gave with my friend Ezra Klein. We were scheduled to talk about filibuster reform, but this was the day of the Newtown tragedy. And so when he called me up, he said, oh, what do you think about the Second Amendment? And we started talking about it. And I said the Second Amendment meant one thing at the founding and a different thing after the Civil War. And that's true of many parts of the Constitution. I wrote a book called The Bill of Rights, Creation and Reconstruction. It has two parts, creation, reconstruction. It's like Old Testament, New Testament. And the Old Testament says a whole bunch of things. There are 10 commandments, but then this reformist rabbi from Nazareth comes along and says, oh, there's an 11th like unto the 10, and it's, you know, to love your neighbor as yourself, and he's reinterpreting it. And if you're a Christian, you read the book of Isaiah as if it says a virgin shall give birth, rather than a young woman shall give birth. You read an earlier scripture in light of a later one. Now, you said it's old. Parts of it are old, but parts of it are a little bit younger. They were adopted in our lifetime. It's been amended over time. So many postscripts. It's an intergenerational project. And then the question is, how much do we reinterpret the earlier texts in light of the later texts? Oh, well, just if you're a Christian, ask your pastor about that, because she or he thinks about that all the time. How much? Because in the Old Testament, oh, what's the personality of God? It's Yahweh, and he's a kind of scary persona, which is a little different than Jesus' Abba, Father, who he has a different understanding, kind of the personality, if you will, of the Almighty. Okay, Christians read, and if you're LDS, there's yet another scripture that you would that would be a prism through which you would read earlier texts. Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. That's the preferred formulation. Mormon is no longer the preferred designation, actually. Just in case you missed that news flash, that was a few years ago. There's the Second Amendment, and it was a product. The Constitution is a product of our history. That's why you need to know our history. And it's the only thing that we have in common is our history. And our history is largely defined by our wars, especially our constitutional wars. The Revolutionary War, the Civil War, World War I and II. But especially, those are especially important constitutional wars. So here's the Revolutionary War. It's the locals against an imperial center. It's in Hollywood Star Wars. It's a ragtag assortment of smugglers and tax cheats. Luke Skywalker and Han Solo and Lando Calrissian against these imperially evil stormtroopers controlled by an evil empire. That's the American Revolution, a ragtag band of kind of smugglers and people who don't like paying taxes and all the rest, very irregular, against a really powerful professional army. And that's going to give you that American Revolution, a Constitution, and a Second Amendment that looks like the top picture. I showed you this before. This is the Battle of Bunker Hill. Come to the Yale University Art Gallery and see this one. It's the most famous political painting in antebellum America. And it's military. And it's localist. The localists are the good guys. The flag of the Union Jack is dark clouds, death, destruction, plague, horrible things. It's localist and military and collective and political. And there's one black guy just at the corner of the story. That's in painting the American Revolution. It's the death of General Warren. It's also got some religious dimensions to it. It's like a secular pietà. Warren is being lowered, in effect, from the cross, but the cross is a flag. It's like a Rubens painting Descent from the Cross or something like that. I could show you the Rubens. I will in a minute, okay. That's the American Revolution. That's the Second Amendment. It's all about militias, okay? And is it about individual right to have a gun in your home for self-protection? Maybe at the margins, because it says keep as well as bear arms, and people kept arms, in their home. But bear arms is characteristically military. It is true that the Minutemen actually kept guns in their homes at the ready, and then, fought at Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill. But that's at the periphery of the story. It's mainly about militias against a standing army, as in kooky Michigan militias today. Okay, I understand where I am, and I understand there are people who think that way today in your state. Now, we amended the Constitution, and we amended the Constitution after a civil war in which the good guys are the central government, and the bad guys are the local government, and if it's a movie, it's Saving Private Ryan. The good guys are actually your central Tom Hanks is not like the evil Emperor Palpatine or these, or Darth Vader or something like that. He's a Pennsylvania school teacher. He's just a decent and national. Who was asking me about the national education? He maybe had to leave, but he's fighting alongside people from other parts of the country. Two fast-talking ethnics from New York City and a deep Southern sharpshooter from Mississippi. Okay, that's the army bringing everyone. The militias aren't that way. You're fighting alongside people from your neighborhood. That's the bottom picture. This is after the Civil War. It's called the Freedmen's Bureau. Let's see if I can make it a little bigger. Okay, but, that's, okay. Well, you see that's Bunker Hill. This is a totally different picture. Okay, but first note the similarities. Flag of the central government in the middle, in both. This one black person in the corner there with and now one black person here in the corner, but there are a lot more. This guy in the center, he's a central government official with his right arm out. That's the same thing that's true of this guy right here. And this is, Han Solo or something. He's a localist with his left arm out trying to protect his fallen comrade. He's just become a Klansman, the guy with the left arm out. Okay. This is a riff, the bottom one on the top one, okay? This is not random. The bottom one is quoting the top one, but it's changing it totally. It's not nationalist, localist, it's national. The central government, this is light and air. It's not dark clouds. The uniforms have come off. It's not political. It's not military. It's not collective. It's individualistic. Here's what they're saying. Here's the top one. When guns are outlawed, only the king's men will have guns, so we need to have local militias. After the Civil War, we don't believe that at all. We have a different vision, which is codified in a thing called the 14th Amendment, which applies the Second Amendment against the states, but changes its meaning in interesting ways that I write about in great detail. And so now, top vision. When guns are outlawed, only the king's men will have guns. We need local militias. Arms bearing militarily. Bottom one, when guns are outlawed, only Klansmen will have guns, only thugs. You need to have a gun in your home if you're a black person for self-protection because you can't count on the local constabulary. And the U.S. government and its flag and this guy who kind of looks a little like Ulysses S. Grant or something will protect you in your right to have a gun. And some of these guns are bayonets. Maybe you had them when you fought in the Massachusetts 54th or whatever. But you get to keep it in your gun to protect you and your family from terrorists, white terrorists. Different vision, okay? Scalia doesn't come within 100 miles of talking about anything like this because he was not serious. He wasn't. I'm giving you what serious originalism is, which is not looking at a dictionary, but knowing your history, knowing the story of the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, and how these result in texts that kind of codify different understandings of liberty and equality and the national government and the states and the parties and the branches in America. And these are complicated stories which I write, which is why I write these longer books, to show you the difference between this. So I'll show you in the new book just two quick things. I know we're getting close to the end, but let's see if I can pull up some pictures from the one I just sent off to. You're not interested in my taxes. Okay, so we'll skip that. I'm not interested in my taxes. Okay, so the first paintings. Here's some cool things here. These initial celebrations of American arms bearing are with American martyrs. These are secularizations of certain great religious paintings. So the top left, that's Rubens' Descent from the Cross. They're lowering Christ from the cross after the crucifixion. And the blonde guy with the very distinctive fuchsia colored or whatever, orangey red, blood orange, okay, that's a young Peter. The top right is The Death of General Wolfe. That's by Benjamin West. And that color is very distinctive, that blood orange and the yellow. And you see it's a secularized pietà. You're being lowered from the flag rather than from the cross. And you're a military person, not a god man. And then I showed you, these are tighter crops, these bottom ones, of on the left, Bunker Hill, The Death of General Bourne, and on the right, The Death of General Montgomery. That's John Trumbull. And if you're a Lin-Miranda fan and you have the full soundtrack of the original Hamilton, you know there's actually a song called No John Trumbull in all of that. Okay. To understand your Constitution, you need to understand not just the text, but the story behind it, and that's art and culture and who your presidents are and what the wars have been about. This is the only thing we have in common. Okay? So you guys know more, I know more, before I started doing this, about baseball or football than about we the people. But we need to understand. You need to follow this with the same kind of interest that you follow Michigan football. Otherwise, we all die, okay? Because it's the only thing that we have in common. And not every one of us truthfully roots for Michigan football. I do, but the people in Georgia don't, and the people in South Bend don't. Maybe not even in Lansing. In the new book, I'll show you one final, this is what I already showed you, but just a cool version of it. Just so you see these two portraits, again. Okay. So this is what I showed you earlier, but I'm going to make it a little bigger here. So you see all the common elements, that the black person, and then down below. And they're all in the same part of the picture. The flag of the central government, both places. The government official, the professional, both places. The localist, both places. In art, this is from Harper's Weekly. The guy is saying, we're taking the original vision and we're modifying it in some ways because we've had new experiences. Now there are four moments. The founding and the Reconstruction, and today when guns are a lot more dangerous and they're different kind of guns, how to think about that. And I know that some of the tragedies have happened here in Michigan, more than one of them, more than your fair share, frankly, and then what you want the future to look like. Okay? I believe in gun rights. I don't have a gun in my home, but I think you do have a right to have a gun in yours. I also believe in gun control. And I think there might be ways, if we had a less dysfunctional Congress, of actually trying to come together about some of these things. Okay, I've been featured in National Rifleman, and I actually briefed the Democratic caucus on what would be serious and constitutionally permissible gun control rather than kooky stuff. And I was cited by the gun rights folks in the last 3 Supreme Court cases on the issue. That is the majority opinion, that is the Rahimi case, the Bruin case, and the City of Chicago versus McDonald case. So I'm not modest, but I'm honest. And I don't own a gun. I don't own a gun, not because I hate people who do. I told you before, my mom, she passed away 2 years ago, and I'm thinking about her today because I'm back in Ann Arbor. This is the first time I've been here since her passing. She was a pediatrician. She saw lots of people dying in gun accidents, so she just didn't love guns. She didn't even like swimming pools, truthfully, because she saw, kids who got drowned. So we didn't have a swimming pool in our house. We didn't have guns in our house. And you're entitled to one in yours, because these books aren't about me. They're about us, and we need to know the story behind it. So I'm glad you asked that question, because I can show you a little bit about the American Revolution. Good guys are the localists. Civil War, good guys are the central government, and that's going to change lots of things. I think we have time for one more question at least. Okay, great. Maybe two. If you guys ask your questions, I'll try to answer them, conjointly.
I did read one of your papers, which I believe you wrote several decades ago.
I'm that old.
In which you argued that the Constitution has an inherent right for a majority of the population to alter the Constitution or alter the government. And I've wondered if you still hold this view, and if so, why do you think this hasn't caught on? I think you provided some compelling arguments about why the framers thought that, and why has this view sort of not taken hold in a popular sense?
Thanks for that. The articles are Philadelphia Revisited in the Chicago Law Review, 1989, and Consent to the Governed in the Columbia Law Review in 1991. And I was telling Elizabeth as we were walking over after lunch, I'm not as sure I was right in those pieces as I once was. And then I'll take, and one of the reasons it hasn't caught on is, frankly, I didn't really factor in enough how big slavery, how large it loomed. Because of slavery, we don't have the Electoral College because of a balance between, I was surprised people didn't ask very much about the presidency given where we are. The Electoral College is not a balance between big and small states. Big state guy wins every time. We've had 4 small state presidents in all of American history. Joe Biden, Bill Clinton, Franklin Pierce, and Zachary Taylor. That's it. 8 of the first 9 presidential elections are won by a Virginian, and that's the biggest state. 2 terms of Washington, 2 terms of Jefferson, 2 terms of Madison, 2 terms of Monroe. The 9th is won by a guy from Massachusetts, Adams, which is the 2nd or 3rd biggest state, depending on your count, and then John Quincy Adams. We have the Electoral College. It's not because they didn't believe in democracy, they put the thing to a vote. It's not because they thought only smart people could decide this, because smart people, were never deciding it. They were told how to vote from day one. It's not a college. Princeton's a college. Dartmouth's the college. This is not a college. They don't meet in one place. They're not allowed to talk. They have to decide everything in a day. They didn't have it for that reason. They believed in democracy. They didn't think smart people knew better than ordinary people. They put the Constitution to a vote. They let you vote for the House of Representatives, which you couldn't under the Articles of Confederation. It's not a balance between big and small states. That's the House versus the Senate. It was because of slavery. In a direct election system, the South loses every time because its slaves don't vote. But the Electoral College allows it to count its slaves with 3/5. I figured that out a little bit later on, but my national popular vote amendment thing would never have passed muster in the South because they were worried that they'd just be outvoted. And I've changed my mind a little bit, and here's why. Because it's true that there's so many good ideas that seem to be blocked, and that frustrates me. But there are a lot of bad ideas that have been blocked too. And in my lifetime, George W. Bush came close to amending the Constitution to say marriage can only be one man and one woman. He came very close. I testified against that. But if the bar to amendment hadn't been really high, he might have cleared that, and that would have been bad, I think. It would have taken away liberty and equality. He came this close, and I like him. He's a decent fellow, but his allies came this close to amending the Constitution to say that you can criminally punish people who burn a U.S. flag in protest. And I think that's bad. I believe in robust political expression. So when I was a young person, I said, oh, it could be so much better. I'm an old guy now, I say, oh, yeah, but it could be worse. And I noticed that almost all the amendments have been good ones. They've made it better. They've made amends, except the 18th, which was balanced by the undone by the 21st. They've added to liberty and equality. Oh, but if the bar were lower, maybe that wouldn't be so. I'm from California. We've had lots of good amendments, but lots of horrible amendments, Prop 13 and other things that have ruined public schools, public education in California, since I was asked earlier, he's not here anymore, about public education. Which constitution do you just instinctively kind of have more affection or loyalty to, the US or the Michigan? And if it's the US, it's interesting because that's the one that's harder to amend. Most people actually have a little bit more loyalty to the US Constitution, which sets a safety net. State constitutions can't go below it. But if we were able to amend the US Constitution easily, especially in an era of Trump, I'm not a Trump guy in case you missed it, then I really worry that if his coalition came in and he had a 51 to 49 majority lead, then out the First Amendment goes. No more freedom of speech, for anti-Trump people. No more freedom of the press for anti-Trump people. What's this free exercise of religion for people who don't have the right religion? So now I won't be able to sleep very well at night, truthfully, if he's reelected. But I'll sleep a little bit better knowing that the Constitution actually can't be so lightly amended. So I've modified my position on that a little bit. But the other position, I don't think it was a stupid one, and I think I'm glad you actually noticed it. It's a very interesting theoretical issue. Very interesting indeed. Your name is? Noah. So thank you I'm very impressed that you actually, encountered that, because like you and 3 other people read it, maybe. So thank you. Last question, I guess? Okay. Sure.
My question is about the Chevron deference ruling that the Supreme Court just put down.
Okay, by the way, how many of you know, I'm very impressed that some of you know about Chevron deference, great, okay.
So in the ruling, it seems clear that the Supreme Court is trying to secure more power for itself.
It is.
See, if this trend is to continue, then how do you foresee something like that playing out over maybe the next 20 years?
So let me take a huge step back and just explain the context of the question. And your name is?
Keshav.
Thank you. So Chevron deference, Chevron is a case that was decided a couple of decades ago that recently got overruled. And Chevron basically said that courts in a range of issues should basically defer, at least to a considerable extent, to expert administrative agencies because they're expert and courts aren't. And now the court has said these are legal questions, and legal questions should be decided by judges, not bureaucrats, and it's up to the judges to say what the law means. And so he rightly says that seems like a bit of a power grab, judges asserting power for themselves. My own view is that it doesn't mean that much, truthfully, and here's why. Because even in the era of Chevron, there were all sorts of limitations. First, there was a thing called Chevron Step 0. It didn't apply to certain kinds of issues decided by agencies. And then there was a thing called Chevron Step 1. The court had to say that the law was actually ambiguous. But if you want to avoid deference, you just say, well, the law is clear. And so you take yourself out of the deference category. And then there was a thing called Step 2, which just says, well, you have to give some deference, but how much? And at the end of the day, you still get to decide. So Step 0, if you didn't love Chevron, you didn't have to, be very pro-agency. Step 0, Step 1, Step 2, there was all of that. Then they added more recently a thing called the major question doctrine. Chevron doesn't apply to certain really important issues, but only smaller issues. So Chevron was being whittled away, truthfully, even within its own terms, death by 1,000 cuts. John Roberts was he's very gifted as a doctrinalist. His preferred mode is actually to do things very gradually. Last term, he didn't do that. He went big with creating ridiculous immunity for ex-presidents, utterly disregarding what Section 3 of the 14th Amendment says about insurrectionists on the ballot. So last term, he went off the rails, in my view. But before that, he generally tended to be very gradual. What I tell my students is, like, he's so good, he could rip your underwear out, you wouldn't feel it. He's very deft. But he decided this time around to go big. He didn't want actually Roe overruled. He actually said, well, we can kind of cut it back and cut it back. So he wasn't actually in the Dobbs majority, which was 5-4, that overruled Roe. Now, I thought Roe was wrongly decided, even though I'm pro-choice, and if it's wrongly decided, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and so you enforce the Constitution. So I had no problem with Dobbs. I'm even cited fairly, honestly, by the conservatives in it. But in Chevron, here were your choices. You're just going to keep whittling down Chevron more and more and more, or you're just going to say, toss it overboard. They decided to toss it overboard, but here's why if you like administrative agencies and you're skeptical of judges, not all hope is lost. Here are some reasons why. The judges still say, the justices, that they will defer to agencies where they think the agency has specific expertise, not because they have to, but because the agency is likely to know more. It's a thing called Auer deference. It's based on a case A-U-E-R. So there's still that. I'm sorry, a case called Skidmore deference. So there's still a different basis for deferring to agencies. More generally, I mean, I'm really, really impressed. You're an undergraduate?
Freshman.
So even more impressed that you're focused on this. But truthfully, I don't think it means so much for the following reason. This is not like who can get an abortion, and wow, that matters if you're bleeding out, whether you can get emergency health care or not. This is not whether we're going to have school prayer in America or not, because that's every day, and if you're not in the majority religion, then every day you have to be pushed out of the classroom when everyone else does the prayer. Okay, I understand how that would feel if you're not in the majority religion. So there are big issues that are very consequential. This isn't one of them because it's basically just a rule about what judges themselves will choose to do, how much or how little they defer to an agency. And if you want to defer to the agency, you can always find a way to do it. You can call it Skidmore. And if you don't want to defer to the agency, you say, step 0 it doesn't apply. Major question doctrine doesn't apply. Step 1, it's not ambiguous. Okay, actually, we get all the way to step 2. I take it into account, but still, in the end, in the balance, I decide the other way. So the pundits have written a lot about this. The lobbyists seem to think it cares. A lot of these lobbyists in D.C. I'm somewhat skeptical, truthfully, that this is going to actually be a really big difference on the ground, because this is a rule only for judges, as opposed to abortion cases, which are rules for every woman in America, or school prayer cases, which are rules about every school child in America. One person, one vote, how we count votes everywhere in America. Those are really big deals. This one seems to me just very much, almost literally, inside the beltway conversations about what judges, will do. And truthfully, unfortunately, you may be right. Judges are going to do what they want to do, unless they're doing stuff that's completely preposterous, and we, the citizens, know enough, because we've read our Constitution, to push back against them. Okay, like Abraham Lincoln and Dred Scott, which is what I've been urging you to do together, to know our Constitution, here I'm ending, and to know the story behind it, so that when they make stuff up, because I don't think Chevron either way is totally made up. This is where I think totally reasonable people could have different views, okay? But Dred Scott just made things up. Blacks were citizens from day one, and of course you can prohibit slavery in the territories. And Plessy versus Ferguson just made things up. It says equal, and segregation, apartheid just wasn't equal. And I actually, even though I'm pro-choice, I think Roe made things up. It didn't actually root it in the Constitution. And this immunity case is preposterous. The Constitution doesn't say anything about the immunity of ex-presidents. It says that we're all under law, that there are no kings in America, we're all equal. So on some of these big ones, the next time I come out here, I hope you guys will know. I know you're a very impressive audience, but you'll know even more about the Constitution, and our friends who weren't here today will know even more about it, so that when things are written down and they're tolerably clear, they're never going to be perfectly clear, Chevron, but tolerably clear, when the court makes stuff up, we can say no. You don't get to do that. And not just courts, presidents, when they make stuff up. Congress, when they make stuff up, don't always trust them, So I think we've reached, yes, we've gone past. Thank you very much for inviting me.